Okay, folks, time for the main event. Believe it or not, it was less than a year ago that a ship caused the Key Bridge to collapse. I will say that I never expected something like this to occur in this day and age. Thankfully, we have experts at Hopkins like Michael Shields doing research on the likelihood of events like this and how we can avoid them in the future. Michael is an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Systems Engineering, and he holds a secondary appointment in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering. He's also a fellow in the Hopkins Extreme Materials Institute. His research focuses on uncertainty quantification for wide-ranging problems in computational mechanics and computational materials science. Dr. Shields holds dual bachelor's degrees in physics from Loyola University in Chicago and civil engineering from Columbia University. He then completed his PhD in civil engineering and engineering mechanics at Columbia. He's the recipient of the Department of Energy Early Career Award, the NSF Career Award, the ONR Young Investigator Award, and the Johns Hopkins University Catalyst Award. And we are very honored to have him join us here tonight. As always, the talk will be followed by a brief Q&A. Please hold your questions until the end, at which point we'll open the floor up. So without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and please bear with me for just a moment while I share my screen. So again, thank you, and I am going to talk about the Key Bridge collapse and the study that we initiated thereafter. But I wanted to take just a moment before I start to really kind of emphasize that, particularly for this audience, that this really is a practical, practice-oriented type of project. This is not some abstract theoretical impact 50 years down the line type of project. And also, in just looking at the EP program, and I know that my co-investigator Rachel Sangri is the chair of our civil engineering EP program. This project really resonates with many of the things that are in that program. There are courses on bridge design, investigation, diagnosis and rehabilitation, port and harbor engineering. All of these things are really relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. But what I want to do is I want to start by kind of taking you back to that day. So I'm going to, if I can get this to work, I am going to play the video. You're going to see it here, and I'm going to run through a really quick timeline of the events that transpired that night. So at 1:25 in the morning, the main electrical breaker in the MV Dali tripped. At that time, the ship was three ship lengths away from the bridge. To give you a perspective, that ship's 1,000 feet long, so it was about 2/3 of a mile away. When it lost power, it lost the main propulsion system entirely. The propellers shut down, the rudder was immovable, and about a minute later, 1:26, the pilots called for a tug assist to come and try to gain control. That tug assist was too far away. About a minute later at 1:27, they dropped anchor to try to slow down as much as they could. And the pilot made a radio call to warn the traffic in the area. And now here you can see we're sitting at 1:27, about halfway through, almost to 1:28. And you can still see traffic going over the bridge. You can see little cars here still passing over the bridge. At 1:27:53, so at this moment here, the MDTA closed the bridge. So the bridge closed at just before 1:28. Now, we're going to hold on for just about one more minute. At 1:29 is when the ship actually collides with the bridge. But here you can clearly see the ship, very few lights on, bearing down on the main support on one of the main supports of the bridge. So just another 30 seconds or so, and we'll see probably what you've all seen several times before. So here you can see the bridge, the ship strikes the pier of the bridge, and immediately the entire structure collapses. Right, five spans of the bridge collapsed, all within less than 10 seconds. So now let's come to let's move this forward. Bear with me again. I'm trying to get the okay. So now, how did we get started? So our whole study started with this simple email. So my colleague in civil and systems engineering, Ben Schaefer, sent this email the following morning. You can see this is March 27th. Can we do a rough PF or beta calc on the Key Bridge? And translation, what that means is, can we calculate the probability of failure or the probability that this type of event would happen? A beta calc is another way of saying a probability of failure calculation. So of course I replied back, about an hour later saying, yes, we can do this. Here's some preliminary ideas. But the main thing was, if we really want to look at this, we need to look much closer at the data. And so that's what really inspired this. So within about a week, we had a proposal to the National Science Foundation to a program called the Rapid Response Program. And the Rapid Response Program is designed specifically for studies like this that happen in the aftermath of a disaster, whether that's a natural disaster, a hurricane, or an earthquake, or a man-made disaster similar to this. So by mid-April, we had a proposal submitted, and our program started in early May of last year. Now, to give some perspective, if you're not familiar with NSF, probably many of you are, but to give you some perspective, in my career, NSF proposals, there's an average of a 7-month review time, and the range is between 4 and 15 months. So to submit a proposal and have funding within about 3 weeks is really, really fast for the National Science Foundation. All right, so what's the basis of our study? Really what we wanted to look at was risk to U.S. bridges across the United States, to bridges across the United States. So what is the risk of this specific event happening? But more broadly, what is the risk that another event like this could happen somewhere in the United States? So I want to start, I'm going to keep things as simple as I possibly can. I'm going to start with a really easy definition of risk, right? Risk is the probability of an event multiplied by the consequences of that event. So if we have an event that is really catastrophic, like a bridge collapse, we want the probability to be very small. Our risk tolerance is the risk that we're willing to accept. At what level of risk do we as a society, do we as individuals, are we willing to accept? Now, the established risk tolerance for bridges in the United States is that the annual frequency of collapse due to a vessel collision for critical bridges like the Key Bridge should be 1 in 10,000, okay? So what that translates into is, you can think of that as being a collapse event every 10,000 years. You want this to be exceedingly rare, okay? So when this occurred, it really, and that I got that email from my colleague, it really called into question, are we actually achieving this risk tolerance? And it also asks the question, if we are achieving this risk tolerance, is this risk tolerance itself adequate? Is it sufficient for what we for what we want it to be? So this led to 2 hypotheses that we posed in this study. The first hypothesis was that the probability of the bridge collapse was underestimated, and specifically the reason that it was underestimated is because the probability of a major collision was underestimated. So that, and I'll get into sort of the basis for that hypothesis in a moment. The second hypothesis was that the probability of a collision of this magnitude occurring somewhere in the United States, not necessarily the Key Bridge, is much higher than it's intended to be by the current codes and standards. So another way we could say this is, if it didn't happen to the Key Bridge, we would expect it to have happened somewhere, to one of the major bridges in the United States. All right, so let's dig into this first hypothesis. So again, we're hypothesizing that the risk was underestimated because major collision probability was underestimated. But why do we say that? Why do we think that major collision probability was underestimated? Well, first of all, we have to go back and look at the historical trend in ship traffic in the United States. And ship traffic has grown tremendously over in recent decades. If we go back to 1980, just after the Key Bridge was constructed, global shipping traffic was about 3.7 billion tons. As recently as 2020, that number was 3 times as high, 10.6 billion tons, and it's only growing every year. So we now see about 3 times as much traffic as we did at the time that the Key Bridge was first built. The other factor is that the ship sizes have increased incredibly. The Dali, which is the ship that collided with the Key Bridge, was close to 1,000 feet long. It was a cargo vessel that held about 4,700 containers, 57,000 metric tons of cargo. To put this in perspective, that's turning the Eiffel Tower on its side, to give you a sense of scale. And believe it or not, the Dali is a large ship, but it's not by any means the largest ship out there. So if we take a step back in time and we look at what was the largest ship at the time that the Key Bridge was built. At the time of the Key Bridge, the Key Bridge was built in 1977, the largest ships in the world were about 3,000 TEUs. And so to give you some perspective, a TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit, and there are 2 TEUs in a ship container, okay? So the largest ship in the world at the time was about 3,000 TEUs. Today, the largest ship is 24,000 TEUs. That's 10 times as large as the largest ship at the time the Key Bridge was built. What U.S. eastern ports, the ports in the eastern United States can handle, are ships up to about 16,000 TEUs. The Dali itself was about 10,000 TEUs. So the Dali, like I said, the Dali was a large ship, but it was 2.5 times smaller than the largest ships out there, just to give you some perspective. So now if we think about the Dali being the Eiffel Tower, the largest ship now is the Empire State Building, okay? All right, so now we have a very, very large number of very enormous ships passing through through American waters. The other thing we need to look at is how the design standards have evolved over time. Okay, so here, most people are really surprised when they hear this, that when the Key Bridge was built, there was no provision in the design code that required it to account for vessel impact. Nothing in the design code said that they needed to account for vessel impact. That started to change in 1980 following the Sunshine Skyway Bridge collapse in Tampa, Florida. And what happened in the aftermath of that was that people recognized that ships were a real threat to U.S. bridges. However, it took 14 years for the design codes to update and to require vessel collision provisions in the design codes. So bridges built after 1994 now account for ship collisions, but any existing bridge, any bridge that was built before 1994 was not required to adopt these provisions. They were not required to be retrofitted or protected from vessel collision. So let's go back to our hypothesis. Why do we think that the probability of collision is underestimated? Well, ships are much larger. There's a lot more of them, and the design didn't account for them. So all of these factors together really led us to believe that there was that we majorly underestimated the risk to U.S. bridges. So let's take a closer look at the current design standards. And I want to emphasize that these design standards are, again, just for bridges post 1994. So this was never applied to the Key Bridge. So I mentioned that risk tolerance level, our annual frequency of collapse should be less than 1 in 10,000. How do we compute that number? Okay, so very simple equation here, lots of terms, but simple enough. It's just multiplication. So the annual frequency, this is what AF stands for, is a product of several different things. So the first, and perhaps the most obvious, is the annual number of vessels that pass under the bridge, okay? So that's the traffic under the bridge. The second component is what is the probability that one of those vessels is going to aberrate, that is going to go off course. And that's this term, this second term, PA. The third term is what's called the geometric probability. And that says, given that a ship goes off course, what is the probability that it will collide with the bridge? And then there's two more factors. One is the protection factor. The protection factor accounts for things like if there are dolphins or protective structures in the water, if there are fenders on the bridge, if the piers are on islands, other types of things that could potentially protect the bridge. And then the last piece is the probability that the bridge will actually collapse, given that there's a collision with an aberrant vessel. In this work, we focused primarily on the first three terms, right? So I mentioned that we were hypothesizing that we're underestimating the probability of a collision, not the probability of a collapse. In order to assess the probability of collapse, we need to have a very detailed model of every bridge, and that's really not feasible, considering that we're studying hundreds of bridges here. So what was the actual probability of a collision? And let's dig into that. So in order to do that, we have to quantify these numbers, right? We have to know what the traffic is, the probability of aberrancy, and so on. So the first thing we did was assessing ship traffic, assessing ship traffic for major bridges across the United States. So what we did was look at what's called automated or automatic identification system data, or AIS. What AIS is actually what AIS is you can think of it as a transponder. Okay, it's a transponder that sends messages to the U.S. Coast Guard once every minute to declare the ship's location, the ship's velocity, the ship's heading, and so on, information that's relevant for tracking that vessel in American waters. And we wanted to use that data to assess historical traffic and aberrancy rates. So we conducted a national survey of large ship traffic under the major U.S. bridges, and that, of course, included the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And what we're currently working on now, but is not complete yet, is establishing true aberrancy rates for large ships in U.S. waters. So again, what is AIS? AIS is a transponder system. It's communicating to the U.S. Coast Guard the location and such of every vessel in American waters. Now, we took that data all the way back to 2009. So we have data for every ship that has been in American waters since 2009, every minute of their travel. To give you some perspective, looking at just 2018 to present, which is what we're going to focus on, more recent data, that's about 1.6 terabytes of data, or 160 million broadcast points from all vessels, again, in U.S. waters. Now, if we look at the Chesapeake Bay as an example of what this data can show us, is you can actually see here, highlighted in yellow and red, you can actually see ship paths going through U.S. waters, or through the Chesapeake Bay waters. And the red the red paths are the most frequently traveled paths. So you can see the Key Bridge is up here. Baltimore is, of course, here. This is the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. You can see there's kind of a bottleneck here, and then Annapolis down here. Okay, so like I said, we're trying to quantify that N, right? We're trying to use the AIS data to figure out how much traffic is passing under US bridges. So the first thing we needed to do is we needed to find where these bridges, where these ships are going. So we identified the 49 busiest ports in the United States. These 49 ports account for just about all of the very, very large ship traffic. So any port that could handle ships that are larger than 150 meters are of interest in our study. Oops. And here you can see just a geographical layout of some of those major ports. So we're looking at all across the United States, East Coast to West Coast, Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, Houston, even some up on Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, and areas like that. So we looked at all of these ports and we looked at traffic coming into these ports. So within these ports, we identified all of the waterways that lead up to these ports. And then within those spanning those waterways, we identified about 5,000 bridges that span those waterways. This is cross-referencing the geographic location of these ports with the National Bridge Inventory. The National Bridge Inventory is a database of all bridges in the United States. It contains about 80,000 bridges nationally. And we found about 5,000 of them that span these major waterways. And to give you a sense of now how we did this, we wanted to cross-reference the AIS data that we pulled from the US Coast Guard with the data in the National Bridge Inventory. So here you can see, I'm going to blow this up, you can see these little dots are AIS data points, and the orange stripe is a line on a map that represents the Chesapeake Bay Bridge as identified in the National Bridge Inventory. And what we needed to do is identify every time one of these ship paths identified by the AIS data intersected with one of the bridges that we identified. And so what we did is we went through and systematically counted every time a ship passed under a large ship passed under a major bridge in the United States over the last 15 years or so. From this, I mentioned we had 5,000 bridges that spanned these waterways. We identified 240 bridges that had traffic larger than 150 meters. We have since expanded that. We now have about 400 bridges in the study, and the major conclusions in terms of traffic were broken down into really two classes. So here you can see on the left, this is a ranking of major bridges that see large ship traffic, and by large ship traffic we mean ships that are larger than 150 meters in length, so about 500 feet or so. And so you can see certain bridges stand out. Of course, the Francis Scott Key Bridge is right there, and the Chesapeake Bay Bridge is right behind it. Those two have almost identical had almost identical traffic. But you also notice that there are certain bridges with much higher traffic, like the Fred Hartman Bridge sees about 30 large ships every day. When we look at the graph on the right, this is ships ranked by what we're calling mega ship traffic. Mega ship traffic are bridges or ships that are longer than 300 meters, so the size of the Dali or larger. And now what we see is there are a couple of different bridges that kind of dominate. The Verrazano Narrows Bridge sees the most traffic up in New York, the Talmadge Memorial Bridge in Savannah, Georgia, and you see that the Francis Scott Key Bridge actually moves up the list. The Key Bridge saw a lot of very, very large ship traffic. It saw a ship the size of the Dali or larger on average once a day. If we look at the historical data, or sorry, if we look at the data for the Key Bridge specifically, we can kind of break this down into what the ship sizes were that passed underneath the bridge. Again, here you can see on the far right, we have those ships that are above 300 meters. And here these are broken down by year. So each bar represents a year. The brown is 2023, purple 2022, and so on going back. See that on average, we're seeing 300 to 400 these very, very large vessels under the Key Bridge every year. A lot of traffic in that sort of 200-meter range. And of course, you can kind of make sense of this too, where you can see the green where there's a notable decline in traffic in 2020, of course, because of COVID. So next, focus on the next two components, which are, we know that there's now a lot of traffic. N is large. There's a lot of traffic going under these bridges. And the next components are looking at what is the probability that the vessel actually goes aberrant and then collides with the bridge. And so what we're looking at now is trying to use this AIS data to assess aberrancy. What we did in our initial calculations, and that's the results that I'm going to present, because quantifying aberrancy is actually quite difficult because there are a lot of different reasons that a ship can aberrate. It could be pilot error, it could be weather, it could be a loss of propulsion event. And trying to arrive at an aberrancy rate is quite difficult, something we're still working on. But the AASHTO code, the design specification, specifies that there's a base aberrancy rate of 0.6 times 10 to the minus 4. So that gives you a sense of the rate at which the ships go aberrant. And then it has a number of factors on it. These factors we're going to ignore for the time being. And the reason we're going to ignore them is because all they do is serve to increase this base aberrancy rate, to make things more to make these type of events seem more frequent. Now, I want to emphasize here that there is no reference in the AASHTO code as to how this base aberrancy rate is established. So we're still looking for it. If somehow we find it, we would love to know where this comes from. These other factors are really heuristic, and that's why we're trying to quantify this aberrancy rate for ourselves rather than relying on these sort of heuristic factors. So now, in terms of the geometric probability, so let's talk about a ship that's gone aberrant. So a ship has gone aberrant. What are the chances that it's going to hit the piers of the bridge? So what the code says that we do is, and I'm going to try to explain this graphic as best as I can. If this here is the bridge pier, can you see my cursor? Okay. If this is the bridge pier, we're going to imagine we place the ship next to on both sides of the bridge, and we're going to take half of that and we're going to project that down onto a normal distribution, where this is the center of the normal distribution is the path of the ship, okay? And we're going to assume that the aberrancy occurs according to a normal distribution. So there's a high chance that it's going to just aberrate a little bit, but there's a low chance that it might aberrate a great deal. And then the intersection of the projection of that down onto this normal distribution, the area under that curve gives us the probability. And the standard deviation, I forgot to mention, of this normal distribution is equal to the length of the ship. So the longer the ship, the wider this distribution is, and the larger the chances it's going to hit the piers. So if I look at, a simple example, I have a ship now passing down the center line. This is the red dashed line is the ship path. And this ship then aberrates. And it's going to go off course randomly according to this normal distribution. These two blocks here, the black blocks, are the piers. If I project those piers down onto this normal distribution, I can compute the probability that this ship is going to collide with one of those piers. Now, there are several problems with this. First of all, the ships oftentimes are not passing right down the center of the shipping lane. If I look at the Golden Gate Bridge as an example, there are actually two dominant lanes that they pass in, and neither one of them is centered under the bridge, right? Both of them are actually a little bit closer to the piers than the main span, than the center span. So now if I think about, okay, maybe the ship is actually passing somewhere much closer to one of the piers, and then it aberrates, the probability that it's going to collide with the pier is much higher. This is not accounted for in the current standards, and it's something that we're working to improve. So now if I look at the key bridge as an example, and I'm going to run just through a very quick calculation of this. If this is the key bridge, this animation here, and we see the Dali coming through the middle here, this normal distribution describes what the code specifies as the probability of aberrancy. And this normal distribution has a standard deviation that's equal to the ship length. So the ship's length is about 1,000 feet. The piers of the key bridge were about 100 feet wide. So if I take this normal distribution and I integrate it over the width of these piers, what I find is that there's about an 8.7% chance probability of collision given that the ship went aberrant. So if the Dali went off course, there was a pretty high chance. I mean, 8% is a pretty high chance that it was going to collapse with to collide with the bridge. And this is, again, according to the AASHTO standards. So if I run this out with some very simple numbers, 3,139 is the average number of ships that pass per year. 0.00006 is the base aberrancy rate. If I knock that 8% down to 5%, just to be really super conservative, and then I apply a 50% protection factor. So make no mistakes, this bridge was not 50% protected. I'm using this only for demonstration purposes. I see that the annual frequency in this case comes out to be about 200 years. That is much, much lower, or much, much higher than we want it to be. And in fact, when we run this out, this is a simple demonstration for illustrative purposes. When we actually run these numbers based on the real traffic and the real ships that pass under there, the actual estimate for the key bridge was we would expect a collision once every 48 years. Now, coincidentally, it was 46 years after the bridge's construction that it was hit. Now, I will mention also that that was not the first time that the key bridge was hit. So we ran this through for many bridges across the United States. And here you can see this is a list of the top 20 or the 20 bridges that we most carefully. And you can see that they range in expectation from a collision once every 17 years for the Huey P. Long Bridge. The Huey P. Long Bridge is a bridge that spans the Mississippi River near New Orleans. The San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, we would expect a collision once every 22 years. If we look down here, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, we would expect a collision once every 86 years. Some others that stand out, the Verrazano Narrows is much longer, every 362 years. And the reason for that is because the span is very, very long. Because it's so long, the piers are very, very far away from the shipping channel. Again, the Golden Gate Bridge every 481 years. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on individual numbers, aside from saying that these numbers are way, way too frequent. These are much more frequent than we want. These are collision events that have the potential to knock the bridge down. I'm not saying that they will knock the bridge down, but they have the potential to knock the bridge down. And if we want the annual frequency of collapse to be 1 in 10,000 years, we cannot have ships of this size colliding with the bridge once every 20 years or once every 40 years or even once every 100 or 200 years. So these numbers confirm our hypothesis. Now I'm going to skip through some proposed changes in the methodology, and I'm gonna end on one final thing with regards to hypothesis two. Remember that hypothesis two was saying if it didn't happen to the Key Bridge, we expected it to happen somewhere. And I want to take that initial 10,000 year return period, and I want to analyze it a little bit more carefully. So let's imagine that every bridge in the United States actually meets this standard, and that we have an annual probability of collapse of 1 in 10,000. From what we've seen, we have about 250 bridges, maybe closer to 400 bridges that see large vessel traffic. If bridge collapse events occur according to Bernoulli trials, and you can think of a Bernoulli trial as a simple flip of a coin, it either, heads it fails, tails it doesn't fail. And that coin has a 1 in 10,000 probability of failure. So 9,999 times out of 10,000, it's going to land on tails and you're going to be safe. But 1 in 10,000, it's going to land on heads and you're going to fail. If we assume that the probabilities work this way, with 250 bridges, we would expect at least one bridge collapse every 40 years. So even with the annual probability of collapse of 1 in 10,000, we're still seeing bridge collapses on the scale of decades. So with that, I will conclude you probably saw on the previous slide that these data are embargoed until next Monday when they will officially be released. So I will ask that maybe the presentation not be shared publicly before then. And I want to highlight that we have a website. It's bridgerisk.engineering.ja.edu. Where you can find our data, and we're also putting up a portal where you can highlight you can zoom in, you can click on a specific bridge, and it will actually tell you a lot of this information. So with that, I want to conclude. I know I'm out of time here, and I want to I want to thank the team. We have a team of 12 students, undergrads, masters, and PhD students working on this, along with my co-investigators, Professor Schaefer and Professor Sangri. And so with that, I'd be happy to take questions, and I thank you again for the warm invitation.
Michael, I think it's a testament to how much folks enjoyed the presentation that 80 people found their way back after after the meeting collapsed. Okay, folks, just raise your hand in using the Zoom, using the under React. There's the raise hand button. And Michael's kind enough to answer a few questions. Ashutosh, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, Michael. How are you?
Good.
I'm glad to meet another Columbia fellow alum. I did my PhD in computer science, electrical engineering there. Yeah. So my question is, first of all, excellent discussion. You made it very interesting. So my question is the type of bridge, is a truss bridge, a suspension bridge, cantilever bridge? There are different kinds of bridges, right? Did you take that into account in your analysis, a probability of finding a collision?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we didn't look at different types of bridges, and the reason for that is because we're not looking at the probability that a collapse will occur if a collision occurs, right? So we're really just looking at what is the probability that there is going to be a collision. Now, different bridge types are going to be perhaps more robust to a collision, and the consequences may be less catastrophic. And so we did not look at the probability of collapse because that really requires a very detailed analysis of each individual bridge. And we just, in the scope of this project over the course of a year, we can't do that for 250 or 400 bridges, let alone, doing it for one bridge is a major undertaking, let alone 250 to 400.
Thank you.
Michael, I'm just curious, is it someone's responsibility to determine, to sort of undertake this task of determining whether a bridge would collapse, how how likely it is that a bridge would collapse given some expected parameters on ship size?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and the it's a perhaps a complicated answer. Right now, when a bridge is being designed, it's the design engineering team's responsibility to do that. The existing bridges really, first of all, are not required to do this under existing policy. So there's no mandate to do this at the current time. The owner of the bridge perhaps has a responsibility to do that, I would argue, especially now in the wake of the events that we've seen and in the wake of these results showing that there is a real risk of collision. So my hope, and I've been presenting this, I've been actually talking to the media quite a bit over the last week. These results are going to be published publicly on Monday to correspond with the anniversary of the collapse next week. And my hope is that we are able to take these results and reach the people like the MDTA who need to make the decisions to investigate specifically and much more carefully each bridge and what protections are appropriate for each bridge.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Okay, we'll move on. Greg Schaefer.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Your analysis appears to evaluate the probability of a collision with one of the two piers on either side of the main channel. Many of these bridges that you've studied are very long, including the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and there are multiple piers in the water. Did the study take into account the fact that there are multiple piers that are subject to an collision?
It did, and in fact, I'm going to pull up here a slide. Here you can see on the top photo is the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge, which really has 4 piers and then this cable support in the center. All four. One of the reasons that the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge is so high on this list is because it has so many piers in the water. And the spans, if you think about this versus the Golden Gate Bridge, right? The Golden Gate Bridge has a very, very long span with the piers set to the sides of the waterway. By contrast, has several shipping channels with several piers in the water, so the chances of a collision are much higher. Of an allision, I should say. I say collision because I think a lot of people don't know the difference, but you're absolutely right to use the term allision.
And the difference being?
A collision is two moving bodies, and a collision is a collision with a stationary body.
Okay. Fantastic. Any other questions, folks? All right. So another EP faculty meeting in the books. I want to thank our program chairs for leading their sessions, our speakers, Paul, Alicia, Danil, Nathan, Heather, Megan, as well as Michael Shields, our keynote speaker. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the tech team did a marvelous job as usual. Thank you to the planning team. Folks, you'll soon receive a request, and I think there's a link in the chat. A request to complete a very short survey about tonight's activities. Please help us continue to improve these events for you by providing your feedback to us. I want to wish you a really lovely spring and summer, and we'll all get together again in the fall. Good night, everyone. Thanks again.